If I get ahead of myself today, I have an excuse. I'm actually still operating on tomorrow because it's actually tomorrow where I've just come from. It's a little bit confusing, actually. Yes, it's good to be here. I think I have been here once before a number of years ago when I came over for a CMJ meeting here. But I don't think I ever came here in the autumn. I think when I came here once before, the leaves had already dropped. So thank you, Carino, for organising it. The leaves are still there for me today. Concerning the situation in Israel, that was a very, very good little presentation from Daryl, done on the run, you might say. It was very, very good. My daughter is one of those who's actually at Christchurch right now. Originally she was supposed to be flying out on the Saturday. She's a volunteer, and some weeks ago she actually decided to stay longer. And so she's there, one of those ones that's there helping to get the place ready for some refugees who are coming in. I think I should perhaps begin with a little bit of a background as well, because there is a lot of correlation between what's happening there now and what happened during the Holocaust with the subject matter that we're touching upon today. Very briefly, of course, the fact is that ever since Adam and Eve rebelled, sinned in the Garden of Eden, the relationship between Almighty God and humankind was broken, and sin came in, and the result of the disobedience was that the penalty of death came upon not just Adam and Eve, but anybody who was born from Adam and Eve. That's all humankind. So there's the penalty of death that's there. But God, in his great love and his great desire for a relationship, personal relationship with humankind, was such that he set in motion a plan of redemption, a plan to bring back this wonderful relationship. And that plan, of course, would revolve around the coming of a seed, the seed of the woman, would crush the head of the serpent of Satan. And so from that very, very beginning, there was a plan to restore relationship. And there's always been opposition from the very beginning, from the very time that God established this plan. There's been opposition from the enemy. Now, this plan was going to be worked out, this plan of redemption, this great plan of redemption, revealing the love of God for humankind and the desire to restore relationship. That plan was going to come through the avenue of covenant. God was going to find representative men in the world with whom he could actually begin to work this plan of redemption out. There was Noah, and then there was Abraham, or Abram, later Abraham. And of course, with Abram, God entered into a covenant. He gave him many promises. In actual fact, the promises came before the covenant was instituted. God gave to Abram many, many promises. The promise of a people, the people of Israel, the people who would come from Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And there was a promise of a land for this people, which is was the land of Canaan and became the land of Israel. And then it was the promise that all families on earth would be blessed through Abraham. Additionally, very, very clearly stated that those who bless Abraham, those who honour Abraham, and the covenant promises God gave to Abraham would be blessed. But conversely, those who dishonoured Abraham, dishonoured the promises that were given to him, would be cursed. So all those were, you might say, a package deal. And you can't, in a sense, separate one of those covenant promises from the rest. You take them all or you leave them. And then later, when Abram had actually obeyed, those were just promises, he now had to obey, and he left his homeland and went to the land of Israel. And in the land of Israel, he was wanting to know, and he asked God, well, what about the fulfillment of those promises? I don't even have anybody from my own line that I can actually pass them on to. And then God took him outside and said, look at the stars of the sky. Count them if you can, so shall your descendants be. And Abraham says, basically, touche, you're right, Lord. But then God said to him that he was going to give him the land. And Abram then actually said to God, well, how shall I know that I will inherit the land? He was questioning the word of God. He was questioning the integrity of God. God said it, and Abram had the chutzpah to say, well, how do I know? And then God, at that stage, did the thing that you'll do. And somebody wants to confirm an agreement, he took him down to the lawyer's office. And he signed a deal with him. Signed it and sealed it completely by himself. No, if it happened today, that's what he would have done. In those days, what did he do? He cut covenant. In those days, that's how you actually would seal an agreement between two parties. He cut the covenant and it was sealed. And so the covenant is cut, the covenant is sealed. God has sworn that he will fulfill the promises he gave to Abraham. And of course, if those promises are going to be fulfilled, that means that ultimately God would have a restored relationship with humankind. Ultimately, it would mean that the enemy, Satan, would be bound. And so from the very beginning, not just from the time of the fall and the promise of the Redeemer, but from the time when the covenant with Abraham was instituted, again, there has been, you might say, enemy activity. And the enemy of our souls will do everything he possibly can to discredit God by destroying, or you might say demolishing, all of those promises that were inherent in the Abrahamic covenant. And so there's a commonality, you might say, because when you look at what's happening in Israel today, well, it's just enemy activity. He wants to destroy the people of Israel and in a sense, give the land back to Islamic authority, into Islamic domination. And that would discredit God because God gave the land of Israel, the land of covenant promise, to the people of Israel. And so there's a lot of activity that's going on that is, in a sense, very similar to the subject matter we're looking at, because God's desire is that all Israel will be saved. God's desire is that the people of Israel would come back to the land, and they'll come to the point where they'll say, Baruch haba b'shem Adonai, blessed be he who comes in the name of the Lord. They'll cry out to the Lord, and the Messiah shall return to the Mount of Olives. But unless there are Jewish people in the land of Israel, that's not going to happen. And so 70, 80 years ago, the enemy made a huge effort to destroy the Jewish people. And what a lot of people don't realize is that in the process of wanting to destroy 11 million Jewish people, 6 million were murdered, but the plan of the Nazis at the Wannsee Conference in 1942 was actually to murder 11 million Jewish people. That 11 million Jewish people included the 700,000 Jewish people who lived in the Middle East in that period of time, which meant 500,000 Jewish people who lived in the land of Israel in the Second World War were also earmarked to be murdered. And so if the Nazis had succeeded in their grand plan of annihilating the Jewish people, that would have meant there were no Jewish people at all living in the land of Israel. Okay, so you see there's a huge amount of commonality between what's happening today and what happened back there. It's to do with the fact that the Word of God, the character of God, the integrity of God is bound up with his covenant promises, and the enemy will do whatever he can to discredit God by destroying and wiping out and abolishing anybody or anything that is associated with the fulfillment of those covenant promises. So when we come to the particular subject matter we're looking at today, which is the Jewish followers of Jesus in the Holocaust, first of all, it's a subject matter that a lot of people don't really give much attention to, because we know that 6 million Jewish people were murdered. But not many people think about the fact that there was a large number within that 6 million who were associated with the church. And probably the reason why a lot of people don't think that, or think about it, is because they would have thought that any Jewish person who was associated with the church would have been safe, would have been protected, would not have been hunted down by the Nazis. But the fact of the matter is, the Nazis weren't interested in anybody's faith, in anybody's worldview, in anybody's ideology. All they were interested in was their bloodline. And so if any person was from a Jewish background and could identify that 4 of their grandparents were Jewish, then they were earmarked for death. Had the war continued, then those who were what we call Mischling first degree, that is, had 2 or 3 Jewish grandparents, or Mischling second degree, those who had 1 or 2 Jewish grandparents, they too would also probably have been murdered. And so by the time of 1945, the Nazis had completed a fairly large part of their plan, but they never got to the Jewish people living in the Middle East and other parts of Europe as well. The Jewish Christians, the Jewish followers of Jesus, were caught up in this because they were totally Jewish. According to the Nuremberg laws, if you had 4 Jewish grandparents, you were classified as Jewish. But for many of those Jewish followers of Jesus, they didn't actually participate in the Jewish community, because the Jewish community didn't want them, because they were so-called mishmadim, or traitors, or converts. And the vast majority of those Jewish followers of Jesus also had in a sense, separated themselves from the Jewish community as well. So that is why in many instances that we can see from the records, a Jewish person who followed Jesus actually didn't even know they were Jewish, because it might have been 2 or 3 generations ago that grandparents or parents had actually come to faith, and they didn't know anything about their Jewish ancestry. But the records were there, and it's because of the records and that Nazis were able to ascertain that somebody was Jewish. So there's quite a bit of material in the subject matter. I don't have time today to go into everything, but why are we doing this particular project? A little bit of background here is that I grew up in the bush of Western Australia, so I call myself a boy from the bush who was saved by grace. But when I grew up out there in Western Australia, I have a very, very strong interest in history. Some might say it's because there was nothing else out there to do. Well, that's partly true, but really it's because I wasn't interested in farming, but I always had an interest in history as a kid. And that interest ultimately took me to Israel, where I came to know the Lord many years later. So when I was doing a lot of reading on the Second World War, because I wanted to know why Australian soldiers, including my own relatives, were in the Middle East in both the Second and First World Wars, I wanted to understand a bit more about that background. As I was reading through one particular encyclopedia, I came upon a whole section on the Holocaust. And I always wanted to know who these people were and why they were being persecuted as they were. So that sort of left a mark in my mind. And I remember once, about the age of 12, I think, I went into the local news agency. We only went there once a month because it was so far away, to buy a sports magazine. And I saw a book on Treblinka, which was the second most notorious of the death camps. I didn't buy my sports book. I bought that book on Treblinka. And so I have to ask myself the question, why on earth would a person who's not Jewish and not from a Christian background buy a book like that? And so things are happening in my life as a kid, which I was unaware of, I suppose, as to where they would ultimately lead me. I lived in Israel for 25 years. And when you live in Israel, you are surrounded by memories of the Holocaust, because there's Holocaust Remembrance Day every year. Many, many times we go to Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum, and I knew people who had survived the Holocaust. For some time I actually worked with Holocaust survivors in one of the hospitals where I was working before I began to work with Christchurch in Jerusalem. So you cannot escape the Holocaust. It's a part of the reality. It's so much part of the psyche of the Israeli people, of the Jewish people. If you really want to understand a Jewish person or the Jewish community, you really do need to understand the impact of the Holocaust upon them. Why? Because every Jewish person knows that if they were there at that time, they too would have been a victim of the Holocaust in one way or another. So it's just something that they carry around with them, consciously or even subconsciously. And so what happened in Israel in the last week or so is just a similarity in a sense, because again, the Jewish people realized, well, if that could have happened to me wherever I was in Israel. The same thing could happen to me because I am Jewish. And so that's just part of the psyche of the Jewish people. While in Israel, I also became involved in helping to set up a Messianic congregation in Jerusalem of Jewish followers of Jesus, and the two main pastors there, they were children of Holocaust survivors as well. So wherever you turn, wherever you look in Israel, you're surrounded by this whole dynamic. But at one particular time in my life, I got involved in another project. It was looking at events which happened in the First World War, and it was a fairly long and in-depth project, and it came to its culmination in 2017, because that was the year in which the land was captured and conquered by British, Australian and New Zealand soldiers, and it was also the year that the British government issued what we call the Balfour Declaration, the promise for a Jewish national home in the land of Israel, once it had been captured. A lot of people think about the Balfour Declaration. They say, well, that's a very, very nice thing to happen. But the fact of the matter is, the land of Israel was then in the possession of the Ottoman Turks, who were the custodians of Islam. So before you have a Jewish national home being established in Israel, you actually, first of all, had to capture the land and take it away from the Muslim Turks. That's what happened in 1917. And so after I'd been involved in these activities for the 100th year anniversary events, had a couple of major events take place, then I actually sensed the Lord just reminded me, or it's just saying to me, basically, that's it, job done. You've done your bit in helping to put together this historical record. Now there's something else. I didn't know what that something else was. So I looked back over my own life and I realised that as a kid I had all these different areas of interest, and I'd actually been able to work upon those and research and write about them as an adult, except for the Holocaust. And I was beginning to wonder, well, where does that fit into it? And I couldn't think of any way I could add to the understanding of the Holocaust. And then one day I got a phone call or an email, one of the two, from a very close friend of mine, David Pelleggi. We were both colleagues together at Christchurch. He was also Carigno's boss there for a while. And David had a whole list of research projects he wanted me to work on. I went down the list and there was only one that actually stood out, and that was what happened to the Jewish followers of Jesus during the Holocaust. It was almost as if he'd been reading my mind, okay? But the Holy Spirit was reading my mind and also enabled David to say, well, listen, here's a research project. David was interested in the project, but he knew he just didn't have the time to devote to it. And he asked me if I would do it. And so that is how the project began. And what's the purpose? Well, one of the main reasons is to actually honour the memory of the Jewish followers of Jesus who died in the Holocaust. We know there were 6 million Jewish people. We know that some of those were Jewish followers of Jesus, but do we know much about them? We want to honour their memory. Okay? The second thing we want to do is to challenge the Jewish community concerning the fact that so many Jewish followers of Jesus died in the Holocaust. Now, I've spoken to a number of Jewish people about the subject matter, and also at Yad Vashem, and they will know that there were some converts. They will know there were some Jewish followers of Jesus in the Holocaust. But they are unaware of just how many. They're unaware of the fact that there were so many Jewish converts, Jewish followers of Jesus. And so we feel it's important that the Jewish community is made aware of this as well, to acknowledge them even. If you go to Yad Vashem, you'll see there's a reference there to 2,000 converts being in the Warsaw Ghetto. And I think that's the only reference. Well, we know there are at least 4,000 to 5,000 Jewish people in the Warsaw Ghetto who are associated with the church. But that's just the Warsaw Ghetto. There's lots of other communities elsewhere as well. We also want to challenge the present church about this matter, that in the Second World War, tens of thousands of Jewish followers of Jesus also were victims of the Holocaust, and the church is unaware of this particular factor. And I think it's also important for us to hear about these stories to give us hope and inspiration. It's not so much to focus upon the negative, but it's also to focus upon the positive, that in many places these Jewish followers of Jesus actually were an inspiration to their own people in the midst of the Holocaust. And we have actually been able to discover some material, and there's a couple of books at the back there relating to some of these people who were a light, you might say, in a dark place. We hear of Corrie ten Boom, and we hear of other Gentile Christians who played a significant role in helping Jewish people during the war, but we also want to know the testimonies of those Jewish followers of Jesus and how they not only inspired others going through those death camps and concentration camps and ghettos, but I think they can also inspire us today. Because today, we're living in a society very similar in many ways to what those people went through back in Europe in the 1930s and 40s. There's a lot of similarities between what's happening in our Western societies today to what was happening there under the Nazi regime. So I think there's a lot we could actually learn. So there are different factors as to why it's important to give some time and research and bring on the subject matter and bring it out into the open. Now, when we get to a subject concerning the Holocaust, we realise straight away it's a very, very deep and dark subject matter. And as I've been doing the research on it, there's been a number of times when I've actually hit the wall, you might say, and I've realised I just have to take a backward step. Now, straight away you've got a problem, because you don't want to look upon this as just an academic research project. You don't want to look upon it as just figures, working out how many people died and all that sort of stuff. But on the other hand, if you get too involved and you get too much into the minor details and looking at what happened to these individual people, you really can actually have some, well, I did anyway, have some problems because I just get so immersed in it. So I've had to try to find a balance about how to look upon the Jewish people who did die and suffer during the Holocaust, recognising that they are individuals, but on the other hand, not getting too immersed in the subject matter. So there's been a need of a bit of balance there. When you are looking at a subject matter like this, you have to look at the bigger picture, which is the Holocaust. And when you start reading about the Holocaust, my goodness, there's a lot of material there. How much time do you spend on reading all the details? You have to understand the details to a certain degree to understand the context. And if you ever actually then want to speak on the subject matter within a Jewish context, you do need to know quite a bit about it. But as I was getting into the looking at the bigger picture, I began to get a bit confused because there's just so much material. And I realized I needed some help. I needed you might say, a research tool to help me actually put things into categories, if I could use that particular word. And on one occasion, I was reading about a Jewish lady who was involved in the church, and for the Nazis, they classified such people as non-Aryan Christians. Okay? If they were a Jewish person who was involved in the church, their classification was a non-Aryan. They weren't Aryan, okay? They weren't Nordic and Caucasian, so they were non-Aryan, and they were Christians, so they're in the church. So they're called non-Aryan Christians. Another way of saying they were Jewish people who were involved in the church. But the official classification was non-Aryan Christian. So I was reading a book about a particular German lady who was a non-Aryan Christian in the western part of Germany, and she was, together with several thousand other Jewish people from western Germany, put onto a train and sent down to the southern part of France, to a little place called Gurs, on the close to the Pyrenees. And I was intrigued by this, and I kept on wondering, why on earth are they taking Jewish people from western Germany down to the southern part of France? Because I'd always perceived they'd gone to the east, to the labour camps and the death camps. But this is somebody being taken down to the western part of France. So as a result of that, I began to do a bit more research into why these people were taken down to the southern part of France, and particularly to a place called Gurs. And I began to realise, well, it's actually part of a plan the Nazis had to transport, at that time, 4 million Jewish people to the island of Madagascar. It's called the Madagascar Plan. That wasn't sort of presented to me straight up. I had to sort of do a bit of fishing around to realise this was actually part of the plan. And so this was something I had, if I'd ever heard this before, it had never registered. It had never been taken seriously. But now I had to take it seriously because it was actually a clear-cut policy of the Nazis in that period, which is 1940, to transport 4 million Jewish people from Europe, that was then under Nazi domination, to the island of Madagascar, off the African coast. The plan was so serious that, for instance, Hitler knew about it, he endorsed it, so did the other Nazi leadership, and a man called Adolf Eichmann was given the goal of actually drawing up a plan for it, together with some others, of course, to make it work. So it was taken very seriously. So that was very helpful in a sense that I now realise that here was a particular phase, I call it a phase of the Holocaust that I was not really aware of before, and it had nothing to do with the murder of 11 million Jewish people, or the murder of 6 million Jewish people, or the murder of any Jewish people in Europe. It had to do with deporting them from Europe to another part of the world. So, like many of us, I think, I then realised, well, my perception had always been the Nazis set out from 1933 with a plan to murder the Jewish people. And I realised that actually wasn't the case. So as I began to read through more materials, I could see there actually were different phases. And I realised that from my perspective, there were 7 phases. And there could be more, but I don't think there's less. So it's a research tool that I developed to help myself to understand this bigger perspective and put all that material into 7 phases of the Holocaust. So that's the bigger picture. So the 7 phases in brief, and there's some materials down there which they are written out in more detail. First of all, there's a period until 1933 when the foundations were laid for the Nazi world view. You see, the Nazis didn't come to power on the 30th of January 1933 and say, hello, we're here, and incidentally, we don't like Jewish people. Okay? The foundations were already laid. Lots of things were happening in German society, in European society, in Western society that actually gave them the ammunition, you might say, to develop their policy of murdering the 11 million Jewish people. And the church is part of that. The historic church and the anti-Semitism in the historic church Also in the Protestant church, the attitude of Martin Luther to the Jewish people, for instance, was very, very negative. And the Nazis used those writings from the church fathers and also from Martin Luther to substantiate their policy towards the Jewish people. There were lots of other factors as well. German nationalism, what was happening in Europe at the time, and also the influence of neo-Darwinism, and eugenics and liberal Christianity. There's a whole range of different things that actually go in to the mixture, you might say, for giving the Nazis their worldview concerning the Jewish people. So that was phase one. Phase two was the period 1933 to 1939, and it was this period when the Germans then began to intimidate and exploit the Jewish people with the hope that they would immigrate. They wanted to rid Germany and later the areas that took over, Austria and Czechoslovakia or the Czech Republic, and they wanted to intimidate and exploit the Jewish people that they would then leave the country, and many did. Many of them incidentally went to the land of Israel. Now that in turn actually created a stir, and the Arab nationalists didn't like that, and so there was opposition in the land of Israel emanating from this particular event. Incidentally, on a parochial perspective, in the 1930s there was a Jewish organization was established to find safe places for Jewish people, and one of those safe places was the Kimberley region of Western Australia. If you look at the map, you'll see the Kimberley is right up in the northern part, and the plan was to actually take 75,000 Jewish refugees to that particular area, and so they would be safe from German opposition. That didn't work out, but there were lots of things happening in order to find safe places for Jewish people. Now, in that context, President Roosevelt convened a conference at a place called Evian in France in 1938 to work out what can be done with these Jewish refugees. And it was a great plan, but none of the great powers of the world stepped up and said, we will take thousands and thousands and thousands. Everybody took some, but not the numbers that were needed in order to extricate the vast majority of these Jewish refugees. The Nazis looked at this and realized, well, we can probably do what we like, and the Western countries aren't going to do much about it, because they actually had representatives there at the Evian conference. All that ended, you might say, when war happened, when the Germans invaded Poland on the 1st of September 1939. And now Jewish people under Nazi occupation were actually, I'd say bottled up. They couldn't go anywhere. The policy at that stage, again, was not mass genocide, although many Jewish people were shot, were rounded up and shot and killed. But the policy at that stage was to put the Jewish people into an area of Poland around the city of Lublin. It was called the Lublin Plan. And it was about the size of Yorkshire. I don't know which state in the US would actually correlate to that, but if you know the gentleman down the back, I think he might come from Yorkshire. Do you come from Yorkshire? No? Anyhow, he knows what Yorkshire is. But anyhow, so it's about the size of Yorkshire. And so the idea was to congregate them there, but in the meantime, the Jewish people would be put into ghettos, and then ultimately they would be transported to this area called Lublin, and it was to be called the Jewish state, you might say. That's where the Jewish people would be taken. In actual fact, they started to take Jewish people from Austria and the Czech Republic to there as well as Jewish people in Poland. But that policy began to be a little bit difficult into 1940, and then the next stage, the next phase came along when the Germans invaded the Netherlands, Belgium and France, and now they had another 550,000 Jewish people under their control. That's when this idea of the Madagascar Plan was first presented, that they would send the Western European Jews there. But then when Eichmann and the others began to work on it, they realized, well, here's an opportunity to rid Europe of 4 million Jewish people, because that's all that was under Nazi control at that time. However, that also was not going to work because they couldn't defeat the British, and the British Navy, of course, ruled the waves in the Indian Ocean at that time. We get into 1941, and there was the invasion of the Soviet Union. That's called Operation Barbarossa. And the Nazis actually had specialized murder squads called Einsatzgruppen, and they were to go in and they were to murder certain groups of people, including Jewish males, because the Nazis had a belief that Bolshevism and the Jewish people were synonymous, and so therefore they would indiscriminately murder Jewish men of a certain age group because they were seen to be conduits of Bolshevism. And so that's how the next phase began. So lots and lots of Jewish men were rounded up and shot by these murder squads called Einsatzgruppen. Then, at a particular time, and I won't go into the details now, but it was July of 1941, a particular letter came from Goering, for instance, through to the Nazis, and thereafter we begin to see that it wasn't just Jewish men being shot anymore, there were large numbers of Jewish men, women and children of all ages being shot. So that was from about July, August of 1941. There was a change in the policy, and we see this very, very much epitomised in Kiev, a place called Babi Yar, in September of 1941, when I think 34,000 Jewish people were murdered, men, women and children, over a space of 2 days, were shot. And the same thing was happening right the way through Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, and those areas at this time. Thousands and thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, even up into the millions of Jewish people were taken out into the forest primarily and were shot. This is called the Holocaust by bullets. And so we were actually beginning to sort of then morph towards the end of 1941. And by that stage, the plan was beginning to be unraveled that yes, well, this is a solution for the Jewish people. They'd already tried a number of other solutions and none of those solutions was working. And so towards the end of 1941, that's when they were already beginning to organise and plan for the total destruction of all Jewish people. They began to then make plans for how to do that in a more humane way, rather than shooting. And so they began to develop the whole idea of gas chambers, or gas wagons actually initially. And again, there's more details about that, but I won't go into those details right now. And so that was even towards the end of 1941, they were beginning to develop this idea of mass murder in facilities. In some places there were gas wagons, okay, but they realised, no, it's much better if we just bring people to a particular location and then we'll murder them there and then we'll get rid of the bodies by burning them. So those were already actually in place. Some of the planning was already in place towards the end of 1941. The final phase, phase 7, begins on the 20th of January 1942 with a conference at a place called Wannsee House, just outside Berlin. And this was convened by Heydrich, who was, you might say, the deputy commander of the SS. And the idea there was they would actually bring in all the different departments, or many different departments of the German government to be involved. So it wouldn't just be the SS doing this through the Einsatzgruppen and the murder squads. And this would be something which the entire government would actually be implicated in. So the Ministry of Transport would have their part to play, the Ministry of Economics would have their part to play, the Ministry of Finance would have their part to play, and the Foreign Ministry would have their part to play. The Foreign Ministry would have a very, very important part to play, because this wasn't just Jewish people under Nazi domination we're talking about, because the plan called for the murder of 11 million Jewish people. A lot of those Jewish people were in areas which were not then under Nazi domination. For instance, Turkey, and also the entire Middle East, where approximately 700,000 Jewish people lived. So in those areas not under direct Nazi control, the Foreign Ministry would actually have to work out some particular plan or something like that with the governments of those countries, whereby those Jewish people would be either taken away into Europe or would actually be murdered in those places. So, for instance, in 1942, they established a specialised murder squad called the Einsatzkommando Egypt, and that was sent down to the Middle East, and that's at the very time when the Allies, which is the British, the Australians, New Zealanders and South Africans and Indians, were fighting against the German forces in Egypt at a place called El Alamein. And if the Nazis had won there, the Germans had won, the army had won, then that Einsatzkommando, that murder squad, would come in and would then work with the German army to begin the murder of the 700,000 Jewish people. Now, they couldn't do it all by themselves. They would do what they did in Europe. They had local collaborators. So in all those countries where lots of Jewish people were being murdered, it wasn't just Germans. Many times it was also local people as well that were involved in the murder of the Jewish people. That was the plan for the Middle East, but thankfully the Battle of El Alamein was won by the Allies. There were many casualties. My mother's cousin was one of those that was killed there. Most Australians had relatives who died somewhere in those battles. And the Nazis were turned around, so all those people were actually preserved and saved. In actual fact, after the war, the Jewish community, the Jewish leaders of what was then Palestine, gave the British commander, a man called General Montgomery, a special Bible of appreciation. And that Bible was a small Hebrew Tanakh. And with that Bible was an inscription, and it said, to Field Marshal Viscount Montgomery, the gallant leader of the victorious British forces, by whose hand God has placed salvation in Zion in the days of El Alamein. Because the Jewish people in the land of Israel understood full well what would have happened if the Battle of El Alamein had been lost. Okay, so that's just bringing sort of a lot of different factors into play here. But nevertheless, despite that, and despite the loss at Stalingrad, and even despite the invasion at D-Day on the 6th of June 1944, despite all those things, they still continued on with their plan to murder the Jewish people, right up until the very end, basically. And so you realise it's not a plan that was being done from anything logically. It's a totally spiritual, inspired plan. It's demonically inspired. And the whole idea was to wipe the Jewish people out entirely. Now, within that context, within that bigger picture, you have those Jewish people who are associated with the church. Were they safe? Were they preserved? Were they protected? Well, in some instances, they were. Okay? And different places of Europe, the Christians, particularly, and other local people, did save not just a lot of Jewish people, but also a lot of Jewish followers of Jesus. In the Netherlands, the vast majority of those involved with the Protestant church were protected. And there's a whole different story about that as well. It's an interesting story, actually, how that all happened. But still, a lot of Protestant Jews were still murdered in the Holocaust. Most of the Catholic Jews were killed. And most of that happened because the Roman Catholic Archbishop, Johannes de Jong, took a very, very bold, courageous and strong stand against the Nazi policy of taking Jewish people out of the Netherlands. And when that happened, the Nazi leader said of the Netherlands, his name was Arthur Seyss-Inquart, he said, "We'll show you who's boss." And so straight away they made a decision to round up the Jewish Catholics. And there were many Jewish people involved in the Catholic Church in the Netherlands. Many had been in Germany and Austria beforehand, and had come over to the Netherlands for a safe haven, but it wasn't a safe haven once the Germans took control. And so straight away, hundreds of Jewish people who were involved in the Catholic Church were taken away, and about 113 of them perished in Auschwitz in the space of a few days. So there were some instances where Jewish followers of Jesus were protected by the church vis-a-vis the Netherlands, mostly with the Protestants, and sometimes in Belgium and in France as well. But in most cases, in most instances, it did not happen. Because as far as the German authorities were concerned, any Jewish person, it doesn't matter how much they were involved in the church, was actually to be murdered because they were Jewish. And so we do have lots and lots of testimonies. Now, then we get to the crucial subject, which for many people is very, very important. For me, it's not so important, is how many? I get asked that all the time. So how many Jewish Christians were there who were murdered in the Holocaust? You want my honest answer? I don't know. My second honest answer is, I don't think we will ever know. My third honest answer is, I don't really know if we should pursue that particular subject matter because it's so difficult to ascertain. One of the reasons why it's difficult to ascertain how many, but I can say there were at least 24,000. Okay, and I'll get to you to the subject later as how I came upon that particular number. I'd say there were at least 24,000, but most certainly in the tens of thousands. And one of the reasons why it's hard to determine that, first of all, is you don't have all the names of the people and where they came from, etc., etc. Secondly, you don't know, there's nothing written down that they were Jewish followers of Jesus as well. The third reason is, how do you define if a person was a Jewish follower of Jesus who was involved in the Holocaust? How do you define that? How do you define a Jewish follower of Jesus? Is it somebody who was involved in the church, okay, who was a member of the church, or was it somebody who was what we would call a born-again Messianic Jew? Okay, so that itself is sort of, it's up there in the air. So I'll give you an example. I've come up with what I think is a tool I work with, that there were 7 categories of non-Aryan Christians. 7 categories, if I can use that word. It's difficult to use that word when you're talking about people. What can I say? Different groups? Okay? So 7 different groups of Jewish followers of Jesus. Now, the first such group were those who were genuine followers of Jesus before 1939. Okay? They could have been somebody who had a genuine born-again experience with the Lord in the 1890s. Okay? And were still alive when the war began. Or they might have died, they might have had children. Okay? And so those children were then brought into the church. So the children might have had a church background, might have gone through the catechism, might have been baptized and confirmed and all those sorts of things. And so to the grandchildren. But do we know if those people actually committed followers of Jesus? Or were they just going to church because that's what, they've been brought up to do? And as a result of that, you had a whole group of people, probably running into the tens of thousands, especially in Central Europe, who were involved in the church in one way. They were fully Jewish on the other. Okay? They had no connection with either the church or with the Jewish community. They were just secular Germans, secular Austrians, secular French people, and etc., and secular Poles. So that's the second category. It was the children and the grandchildren of those who had a genuine relationship with the Lord sometime before. The third group would be those who married a Gentile spouse, a Christian spouse. Now, in such cases, that person would have had to have a catechism, some teaching. Who knows? They might have been convicted that Jesus was the Messiah as a result of going through that. We don't know, but that's another very, very large group of people. Okay, so that's three there, or four groups there straight away. So then, when the war began, you have the situation where a lot of Jewish people, you might say, converted for the fact that it was the only way to actually be preserved. The only way that they could actually be saved, and we know that from a few circumstances where the Bishop of Lyon, I think, was one example, and also the Anglican Church in Vienna gave out baptismal certificates because it was seen to be the best way that they could be preserved. And then there were others who had a genuine belief in Jesus as the Messiah during the war. And we have a few examples. There's one guy called Ernest Cassuto. He wrote a book called The Last Jew of Rotterdam. He later came over here, for instance, to the States. And in that book, he's a person, he and his fiancée, Hetty Winkel, both actually were convicted that Jesus was the Messiah during the war itself. In actual fact, it was a very interesting situation with those two because they were totally secular Dutch Jews. They didn't know much about even their own Jewish faith. Until such time as the Nazis said, no Jews can go to this beach, no Jews can go to this restaurant. And suddenly, as Ernest Cassuto himself wrote, he said, well, I better find out what it means to be a Jew. If I can't go here and can't go there. He didn't know much about his own Jewish life. And so he began to pursue this about Judaism. And then, I won't go into the details, but very interestingly, he came into contact with a very, very prominent Jewish man who was a follower of Jesus called Johannes Rothenburg. This was in the Netherlands. And Johannes Rothenburg was a pastor in the Dutch Reformed Church. And so this young Jewish couple, who wanting to know what it means to be Jewish, were taken to this particular meeting and they heard this Messianic Jew using today's terminology. They didn't use that terminology in those days, of course. They heard him give a presentation and they were just, wow, what's this? How can you say this? Well, I'm Jewish, but you're a Christian. No, I'm a Jewish follower of Jesus. And they were absolutely intrigued. They, coming from a secular Jewish background, had really never had much contact with this ideology before. And as a result of that particular meeting in time, they both gave their lives to the Lord in the midst of the war. Ernest Cassuto survived, and therefore we have his testimony. His fiancée did not. They had to go into hiding, of course, because the deportations began. They had to go into hiding, and she ultimately was found out and was sent off to a place called Sobibor, but she didn't actually die in Sobibor. I've managed to follow some of her life story through. She died somewhere near Sobibor. And there's a few reasons why that may have happened, but many of the Jewish people were sent to either Sobibor, which was one of the 5 death camps. I'm getting my 7s and my 5s confused. It's because I'm working on tomorrow's time. There were actually 5 death camps. There was Auschwitz, there was Treblinka, Belzec, Sobibor, and another place called Chelmno. Some people say Majdanek as well, but let's say 5. So most Jewish people in the Netherlands were sent to either Sobibor or to Auschwitz. So anyhow, this young couple, they came to faith in Jesus as Messiah, and they aren't isolated incidents. At the end of the war, there were so many Jewish children and teenagers who'd been hidden during the war but had come to faith in Jesus as Messiah. They actually had to set up a special little organisation called Haderech in order to be able to bring these people into contact. And it was in one of those meetings straight after the war that Ernest Casuto met another young Jewish lady who'd come to faith in Jesus as Messiah, and they later became husband and wife, and they came here to the States. And so his book is called The Last Jew in Rotterdam. It's really worth a read. Another Jewish follower of Jesus who went through all this was a guy called Rachmiel Friedland, and he was another survivor. Therefore, we have his writings. And he wrote a little book called Joy Cometh in the Morning. And he too survived and later came to the States and became a Messianic rabbi here. I think it was in Cincinnati, if I'm not mistaken. And so he wrote too about his life as a Jewish follower of Jesus, going through all the ordeals he had to go through. There's another family called the family of Jacob Yotch, and there's a little booklet up the end there. That one's, I think it's complimentary on the life of Jacob Yotch. So his family were from Poland, and Jacob survived. Jacob Yotch was the pastor of a congregation in Warsaw, which was operated by CMJ, the same ministry that Crenio heads up here. So CMJ had a very, very large operation in Poland before the war, and had a large congregation in Warsaw. Over 100 Jewish males, or Jewish adults, were in this congregation. Okay, so it was a very, very thriving congregation. Jacob was the pastor. He was out of the country when the war began, so he couldn't get back. But the rest of his family had to go through the ordeals of the Holocaust, and they were all followers of the Messiah, Jesus. Ultimately, when the Nazis took control over over the Soviet Union in 1941, they had to go into hiding. His parents were in a place called Lvov. You've heard of that of late because it's in Ukraine. They had to go into hiding. And the father was put into a woodshed. A Gentile Christian hid him in a woodshed for 2.5 years, whereas the mother passed herself off as a Polish lady. And actually, she stayed in the house, and German soldiers were billeted in the house. They didn't know she was Jewish. She looked after the kitchen, and that was her little domain. And in 1944, not that many weeks before the Soviets liberated Lvov, and Jacob Yotch, his father, his name was Vasily Yotch, was discovered by the Gestapo. They came to the house, and they wanted to ascertain if he was Jewish, and the way they could do that, as a male, they did a body search, okay, which revealed that he was a Jewish male. He was taken away, and he was shot. The mother of Jacob Yotch's name was Anna. She survived miraculously, but she was paralyzed from the waist down, and in an incredible way, it can only be described as a miracle, I think. She managed, with the help of another son and daughter-in-law, managed to get out of Poland, which was then taken over by the Soviets, and got to England to be with the son who was still there. He was now a minister in the Anglican Church in London. And later they came to Canada. And while they were in Canada, the German government made a decision they were going to give financial compensation to survivors of the Holocaust. But, of course, anybody could then just say, listen, I survived the Holocaust. But the Germans would actually then have to do some research to find out if the person was genuine. So as a result, Jacob Yotch made an application on behalf of his mother, who was a genuine survivor. The Germans then had a lawyer who then looked into it, and over a period of time, there was correspondence between the German lawyer over there and Jacob Yotch here and his lawyer, here being in Toronto, and a file began to develop with all this correspondence. Ultimately, they tracked down eyewitnesses in Lvov who actually were there at the time when this man, Vasily Yotch, was discovered, arrested, taken away, and shot. So verification. And they also verified what happened to the mother. Now, some years ago, when I was doing my research, and to do this research, I've had to go to a lot of different places all over the globe. I've been to most of the places in Europe where these atrocities took place, except for in Belarus and in Ukraine. A lot of research in archives. And some years ago, 2018, came here to the States and to Canada and went to the place where Vasily Yotch's archives are kept through his son. His son, Jacob Yotch, has an archive in Toronto. And there I was able to speak to a surviving grandson who had lots of information. And on one occasion, he brought out this file. It was about that thick. And the grandson, the son of Jacob Yotch, the grandson of Basil Yotch, said, I've got this file here. It's all in German, and I don't know what to do with it. I actually thought about throwing it out. I said, I don't know. So I opened it up. I don't know much German, but I could tell dates and names and things like that. So when you go through it, then you begin to realise this date, that's the day, obviously, when he was discovered and shot. And so I photographed a lot of those pages, and David Pleggy's daughter-in-law, Deborah Pleggy, from a German background, was able to translate those. And so we actually had a very good dossier of what happened to an entire family during the Holocaust who had survived and somebody else who had died. And you don't often get that material when doing something like this. It was a gold mine. And so that's why ultimately we told the story of what happened to the Jewish people who followed Jesus or involved in the church in Poland through this particular family. It's called Vasily and Anna Yotch, victims of the Jewish Christian victims of the Holocaust. So I'm not quite sure, Carina, what my time frame is for this presentation today. I could keep going on for a lot longer, but I think time might be catching up with me. But let me just give you one other testimony. It's from a man called Johannes Rothenberg. Have you got room for just one more testimony? Okay. There are many different testimonies. And what we are endeavouring to do is discover as many as we can, because it's going to be an impossible task to find out all the details. But let's try to find what we can in order to understand the context of what happened. So there's a guy called Johannes Rothenberg. As I said before, he was actually very, very much an Orthodox Jewish person, came to faith in Jesus, came over here to Chicago, actually, to do his training, and trained up in the Reformed Church, went back, and ultimately was in the Netherlands at the time of the German occupation. And he was a Dutch Reformed minister. Now, in those days, the Nazis used to send in spies to all the Christian meetings just to hear what was being said from the pulpit. And that was reported back. So here you have this man, another guy called Joseph Cohen, another Jewish follower of Jesus who was a minister in the Reformed Church. Of course, you can almost imagine they weren't going to be sympathetic to the occupiers when they were giving their presentations. Both those two men paid with their lives. And so Johannes Rothenberg was arrested because of the content of his sermons, as much from the fact that he was Jewish. But when he was taken to the various concentration camps, he was given extra special treatment because he was Jewish. But we do have testimonies that in the three places he went to, he testified of the Lord. He actually, in one place, led Christian services when he wasn't supposed to be doing it, and got beaten up terribly because of that as well. And he ultimately was sent to a place called Mauthausen, which was a concentration camp in Austria, which was a labour camp, and it was terrible. Anybody who went there was worked to death. And so we do have testimonies that he actually led people to faith in Jesus as Messiah in the context of the Holocaust. Now, my final subject is on the matter of numbers, and I'm finishing up on this, because it is something which a lot of people are very interested in. How do you find the numbers? I think it's impossible. But some years ago, I was reading what happened to the Jewish people in the Netherlands, and I read that the Nazis actually, because in the Netherlands, as in Belgium particularly, they had to fill out registration forms with all their details. And on those registration forms, there was a little categorization called religion. Well, they're all Jewish, okay, but it's a matter of whether they were Orthodox or atheist or Roman Catholic or Protestant, and they put up there who they belonged to, who they identified with. And so a Nazi official, so I read, had gone ahead and gone through all the 100,000 or so registration forms in the Netherlands and had compiled a booklet with 1,881 such names. Not just a booklet of names, but all the details that they'd written on their form. So I knew this booklet existed, but I didn't know where the original source was. I just kept finding secondary sources, quoting from this original source. So I went to the Holocaust Research Institute in Amsterdam with my sister-in-law, my wife's twin sister, and so we asked the archivist, and I said, this is what we're looking for. And the archivist said, well, where's the original source? And I said, well, that's what we've come here for, to find it. And he didn't know about it. So he went to another secondary source, hoping they would tell us where the primary source was. No, he just alluded to another secondary source. So we kept on going to all these books, but none of them told us where the original source was. Well, I can't operate without a primary source. And so the guy came out ultimately with a pile of materials that thick, and it was all the different files associated with the church during the Holocaust. And so we started to go through it, like trying to find a small needle in the big haystack. Finally, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, my sister-in-law finds the little booklet. She says, "Kelvin, I think this is what we're looking for." And it was. All those things were written out small, typed up small, but we couldn't photograph it, we couldn't photocopy it, of various laws which are actually endorsed by the United Nations. So I had to sit there with my laptop, and my sister-in-law, and then her husband, and then my daughter, we all came in. We had our laptops there, just writing out all these details for about 5 days. I then had to take that information back to Australia with me and go through the records that are associated with Jewish people from the Netherlands who were deported, find out those names were there, and then find out from other records from Yad Vashem who was murdered and who was not. So that was a very painstaking and long process. And we came up with ultimately 430 of those Jewish followers of Jesus were murdered. Now that's not to say that's the full number. And more than likely the number was much higher because a lot of people would not have written down that they were involved in the church. There were Jewish people during the war who came to faith and were also murdered as well. But nevertheless, it gave me some data to begin to operate with. 430 Jewish followers of Jesus who we know actually were murdered. Now, which of those 7 categories... Okay, I don't know. Which of those 7 groups do they belong to? I don't really know. That's for some future research. Then it came to Belgium, and I knew there were a similar situation there. I knew there were registration forms that had been written out, but no Nazi official had gone ahead and actually taken out all the details. I had to go and do that myself. So 8 solid days, 9 solid days at the institute in Belgium, a city called Mechelen, from early morning to late night, just going through 45,000 registration forms. Some of those registration forms were 2 or 3 pages. So it was 100,000 pages I had to go through to find the details. Now, I may have missed some because you're under stress to write the details. You write them down, you write down the category number, then you have to go through later and blah, blah, blah. It's the whole string of things had to happen. And then comparing those names to those who were then deported, and then again, those who were deported to Auschwitz primarily with the Yad Vashem database as to those who were known to have been murdered. And so from all that, came up with about 80 that we can say were actually Jewish people involved with the church who were murdered in the Holocaust in Belgium. More than likely, the number is higher, but that's the data I have to work with. So those are 2 countries that we actually can go to data. We don't have that opportunity anywhere else, basically. Germany, I'm starting on Germany next year. There may be an opportunity there for getting some registration forms. So with that data, we can do a bit of arithmetic, and that's where I said I came to approximately 24,000 Jewish people involved in the church died in the Holocaust. That is a low number because we know that in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, a lot of the Jewish followers of Jesus were actually protected, okay, and weren't sent away. However, that wasn't the case, primarily with those who were in Eastern Europe, Poland, Lithuania, Estonia, sorry. It is getting late. And Belarus and Lithuania and Ukraine. Okay? In those countries, very, very few people were protected because they're involved in the church. So I'd say a base number of 24,000, more than likely much higher. It doesn't matter if it's few or many. There were people involved in the church, and there were Jewish people who were murdered for one reason only, because they were Jewish. And I think it's our responsibility to do what we can to discover as much information as we can about these people, that we can honour their names. And what do you think those people would prefer, would want above all else? Yes, that we remember them, but I'm sure that they'd actually want their testimonies to live on. I'm sure they'd want their testimonies to give life even today. I'm sure they'd want their testimonies to speak to the hearts of Jewish people today. I'm sure they want to see Jewish people come to faith in Jesus as Messiah today. And so, in a sense, we do this also that we want to equip the church with information as much as we can. Now, Carino and Philip can do a certain amount in their work. They've been called by the Lord to introduce Jesus to the Jewish people. And we have an incredible message to give. If Jesus really did take the penalty of death that was upon all of us, Jew and Gentile, if Jesus really did take that penalty of death upon himself on the cross, if Jesus died so that we could live, then surely it is our responsibility to take this message out. If Jesus really is who he said he is, if Jesus really did what the church has historically said he did, that's a message for all people, to the Jew first and also to the non-Jew. Because this is the message of life. Jesus saved us from the penalty of death. My goodness. Is there a greater message that's ever been given that reveals the love of God than this? That's our responsibility. Some have been called to minister to the Jewish people. However, each and every one of us has the opportunity of being in contact with Jewish people. It's up to us to do what Paul instructed us to do, to provoke the Jewish people to jealousy for the Messiah. So in a sense, the more information that we have, the more opportunities we have, the more things we actually have to work with. And this is not to glorify the Holocaust at all. But this is to actually say, when you're discussing with Jewish people, when you talk to a Jewish person about the Holocaust, it is the most sensitive subject you can talk to Jewish people about. And they will often retort and say, well, where was God during the Holocaust? What was the church doing? And in many ways you say, you're right, where was God? What was the church doing? Many times the church was actually not to be seen. However, there's one thing you can say to them. We know that possibly the vast majority of the Jewish people who were involved with the church also died in the Holocaust. They were not saved because they were involved in the church, except for in some situations, yes. But generally speaking, that was not the case. And it wasn't just a few converts. When I spoke to somebody in the Yad Vashem about this some months ago, when I gave them copies of the books I'd done, they were embarrassed. They thought it was just a few. I said, no, we're not talking about a few. We're talking about tens of thousands. And so when you can actually say that with some authority, you might actually have those other people beginning to take attention to what you're saying. And ultimately, folks, it's all about, we say saving the lost. But we want to realize what Jesus did, taking that penalty of death upon himself so that we can live. That's the message we are compelled to take to others. As Paul said, to the Jew first, and also to the non-Jew. Thank you.